There is a quietness to the early days of July 1942 that feels almost deceptive, a kind of suspended stillness in Amsterdam before the rhythm of normal life collapses into secrecy. For a 13-year-old girl named Anne Frank, the world was about to shrink into a handful of rooms above her father's workplace, a world she would later call the secret annex. And although she could not know it then, this moment would mark the beginning of one of the most hauntingly remembered stories of the 20th century. To imagine Anne in those first days inside the annex is to imagine a person trying to recalibrate her senses. Just days earlier, she had walked freely through the city, wearing her school bag and talking about cinema stars, friendships, and the ordinary dramas of adolescent life. But now the space around her had changed. Footsteps had to be measured. Whispers had to replace ordinary speech, and daylight could not touch her directly unless filtered through curtains and shadows. Still, if you had looked at her that week, you might have seen a girl trying to adapt with a mixture of apprehension and stubborn hope. Anne was young, energetic, expressive, and confinement would never fully erase those qualities. The rooms of the annex were narrow and steeply angled, their ceilings sloping in ways that felt almost like sheltering hands. The wooden floors creaked, and every creak mattered. The walls, pale and unadorned, waited to be claimed by the lives of the 8 people who would inhabit them. Anne, her sister Margot, her parents Otto and Edith, the Van Pels family, and later Fritz Pfeffer. In time, Anne's walls would hold magazine pictures she pasted up to brighten the darkness, a small act of resilience that allowed her imagination to stretch beyond the physical boundaries. In these early days, however, the rooms were still bare. The air smelled faintly of dust, of old boxes, of paper and ink drifting upward from the warehouse below. The annex was not a home yet. It was a shelter built from fear, necessity, and the hope that anonymity could preserve life. Anne's adjustment was shaped by her relationship with her diary, a red and white checkered notebook she called Kitty. She had begun writing in it just weeks earlier, unaware of how essential the diary would become. The diary allowed her to build a world inside her mind that was more spacious than the secret rooms around her. In the annex's earliest period, she was already confiding things she could not say aloud, frustrations, dreams, insecurities, and the uneasy awareness that childhood was ending more abruptly than she had expected. Yet her imagination did not retreat. She observed the adults with both youthful curiosity and growing psychological insight. She described the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the tension of shared space, and the small triumphs and defeats that filled each hour. Anne possessed a disproportionate talent for noticing life, even when that life was compressed into 4 walls and long hours of silence. But behind these details, behind her observations of routines and irritations, lived the reality that the outside world was becoming increasingly dangerous. The Franks had gone into hiding a day sooner than planned because Margot received a call-up notice from the Nazi authorities. That single piece of paper meant deportation, and deportation, at that time, was whispered to mean something far worse. For Otto Frank, This realization had struck with the unambiguous force of a bell being struck in an empty room. Loud, sharp, undeniable. His decision to hide his family was an act of both desperation and love, a last attempt to shield his daughters from the machinery tightening around European Jews. Inside the annex, Anne's world contracted but also intensified. The family relied on their helpers, Miep Gies, Bep Voskiel, Johannes Kleiman, and Victor Kugler, whose courage formed a lifeline between the hidden and the free. Their footsteps on the stairs were both a relief and a reminder of what could be lost. When Anne heard Miep's voice, gentle and steady, she felt for a moment the warmth of the outside world seeping into the annex. But when the helpers left each evening, the silence settled again like a heavy cloth. Anne's days quickly developed a rhythm. Mornings were spent studying, reading, and writing. Afternoons required absolute stillness while workers labored in the warehouse below. Even the flush of a toilet could risk discovery. It was during these long hours of forced quiet that Anne's thoughts deepened, sharpened, and evolved. Her diary entries became more reflective, more analytical. She was beginning to understand herself in ways perhaps few her age ever do. Even so, she was still a teenager, and the annex, for all its dangers, was also a container for distinctly adolescent experiences. She argued with her mother, felt misunderstood, sought privacy in a place where privacy was a luxury. She developed a friendship, then a tender affection for Peter Van Pels. She navigated boredom, loneliness, and bursts of creativity. Her life had become an extraordinary contradiction. A young girl living an entirely ordinary adolescence in utterly extraordinary circumstances. In these first months, Anne did not know the fate that awaited her. She did not know that her diary would survive when she did not. She lived each day inside the narrow channels allowed to her, yet she filled those channels with a voice wider than almost any of her time. And though the annex was a place of fear, it was also a place where her spirit refused to collapse. In its stillness, she sharpened the clarity of her thoughts. In its quiet, she developed her remarkable ability to translate emotion into words. The calm of these early days was fragile, but it existed. And within it, Anne Frank began to transform the confinement around her into something the outside world could never take, a testament of presence, written one page at a time. 2. The last winter before the end. A fading world and a fading light. There are winters in history that feel colder than the air around them. Winters in which the frost does not simply cling to the windows, but seems to settle upon the human heart itself. The final winter of Anne Frank's life was one of those winters, quiet, heavy, and marked by a slow unraveling of hope. And yet, in the midst of that eroding world, small flashes of humanity continued to flicker, like candles refusing to be blown out by a merciless wind. To understand Anne's final months, one must step gently into a landscape that has no clear horizon. After the arrest of the Frank family in August 1944, the familiar warmth of the secret annex dissolved behind them like a dream someone was shaken awake from too soon. What followed was not one single tragedy, but a series of transitions, each one colder, harsher, and more detached than the last. It is in these transitions that we begin the story of Anne's final days, not because they define her, but because they reflect the immense strength she carried in her heart. When Anne arrived at Westerbork Transit Camp, she was not yet broken. The camp was crowded, dirty, and suffocating in its hopelessness. But Anne still had her family close and her imagination intact. She was assigned to a punishment block for people who had been found in hiding, forced to perform exhausting labor from dawn until dusk. Yet even here, surrounded by monotony and despair, she tried to find small things to hold on to. Stray beams of sun through a window, the distant sound of voices singing, or the quiet moments when she and Margot whispered about the future they still hoped to see. The guards noticed her energy, her quick movements, the spark in her eyes. Other prisoners noticed her kindness, the way she tried to comfort those who had lost more than she had, offering soft words or sharing scraps of fabric to patch torn clothes. Even in the whirlpool of destruction, Anne seemed able to produce something gentle. But nothing in Westerbork remained still. This was not a place meant for living. It was a corridor. And in September 1944, Anne and her family were pushed to the end of that corridor and forced onto a train bound for Auschwitz, one of the last transports before the camp was liberated. The train journey was long, suffocating, and filled with the cries of families being torn apart. Yet even here, Anne held Margot's hand, whispered encouragement, and urged her to stay strong. She tried to believe that this journey was temporary, that life would continue somehow. Auschwitz, however, was not a place where hope grew easily. Upon arrival, chaos overwhelmed everything. Women screaming, dogs barking, guards shouting, smoke drifting through the air like a warning from the sky itself. Anne, only 15, tried to maintain a calm face for her sister, for her mother. But the truth of Auschwitz was immediate and merciless. The men were separated from the women. Otto Frank was swept away in the opposite direction before he could look back at his daughters one last time. Anne, Margot, and their mother were pushed into the line of women deemed fit for work. This single moment, this fragile thread of chance, kept Anne alive for a few more months. For many others on that same train, life ended within the hour. Inside Auschwitz, Anne's hair was shaved, her clothing was taken, her name was replaced with a number. The cold nights seeped into the bones, the endless labor drained the body, and the cruelty wore down the mind. Yet Anne did not crumble as quickly as the place demanded. Other prisoners recalled how she talked about wanting to write again someday, how she spoke of the annex as if it were a distant but cherished island, floating somewhere beyond the reach of brutality. But starvation works slowly and silently. It steals energy first, then spirit, then body. Disease spreads through the barracks like a shadow dragging itself across the floor. Anne witnessed horrors that no young girl should ever see, and still she tried to care for Margot, to share her food, to help her mother when she could. By late October 1944, Anne and Margot were transferred again, this time to Bergen-Belsen. If Auschwitz was terror, Bergen-Belsen was decay. The camp was overcrowded, muddy, and filled with the sounds of coughing, groaning, and the heavy breathing of feverish bodies. No gas chambers, no structured system, just disease, hunger, filth, and the slow collapse of all systems meant to sustain life. And yet, despite everything, Anne still tried to stay alive. She still believed, somewhere deep in her chest, that her father was alive. She still believed that the war would end soon. She still believed that she would one day return to writing. But hope, too, is a fragile organ. It can be bruised, it can be broken. When typhus swept through Bergen-Belsen, it did not choose victims selectively. It took whoever was most weakened, most starved, most exhausted. Anne tried to care for Margot until Margot fell from her bunk, too weak even to stay lying down, and died soon after. Without her sister, Anne's last thread snapped. She was tired, sick, freezing, and utterly heartbroken. And yet, there are accounts, whispers from survivors, that even in her final days, Anne spoke softly, sometimes even comfortingly, as if reminding herself of the girl she had once been, the girl who wrote stories in a hidden attic, the girl who dreamed of becoming a writer, the girl who still believed in the goodness of people, even when surrounded by cruelty. Anne died in late February or early March 1945, at 15 years old, only weeks before the camp was liberated. Her final winter was cold, cruel, and merciless, and yet there's something indescribably human about the way she carried herself through it. A soft glow in a world gone dark. 3. The Red-Coated Girl. A symbol, a memory, a fragment of hope. There are moments in history that become symbols, not because someone chose them to be, but because they capture something too powerful to ignore. The image of a girl in a red coat walking through the bleakness of the Holocaust is one such symbol. A single dot of color drifting through a gray and dying world. Though the story of Anne Frank does not literally involve a red coat, the symbol belongs to her just as much as to any child of that era. It is an emblem of innocence surrounded by cruelty, of youth overshadowed by forces far beyond its understanding, and of a life extinguished far too soon. To imagine Anne during her final months is to picture a young girl shrinking inside clothes too large for her thinning frame, wrapped in layers that could never shield her from the cold. But the red coat, whether literal or imagined, represents something deeper. The memory of who she was before the camps, before starvation, before loss hollowed her from within. It represents school mornings in Amsterdam, laughter echoing through the annex, the color of courage against a canvas of despair. In this section, we travel into the symbolic meaning of Anne's final days, not through the strict lens of documented events, but through mood, tone, and emotional truth. For historians have captured what happened, but the heart still seeks to understand what it felt like. To understand Anne through the symbol of the red coat is to imagine the human spirit struggling to stand upright in a storm designed to tear it down. The coat is the part of us that clings to memory. Imagine Anne remembering Amsterdam, warm sunlight flickering across the cobblestones, bicycles clattering past, the flower stalls bursting with color. Imagine her remembering the annex, the comforting sound of her father turning a page, the whisper of Margot's quiet steps, the familiar creak in the floorboard she had learned to avoid. These memories were not luxuries. They were survival tools. In the darkest places, they were the red threads she held on to. Other survivors of Bergen-Belsen described moments when people clung to tiny fragments of their former lives, a favorite lullaby, a childhood phrase, a color they adored, as if those single memories could anchor them to the world. For Anne, that symbol may well have been red. In her diary, red appears as energy, as life, as passion, as defiance against fear. And so the red coat becomes more than a garment. It represents every spark of warmth Anne carried with her, despite the ice closing in from all sides. In the muddy barracks of Bergen-Belsen, Anne would have been surrounded by the sound of coughing, moaning, sniffling, quiet crying, and the restless shifting of bodies in overcrowded quarters. The stench was overpowering. The diseases were merciless. The ground was cold and wet. The wind cut through the cracks in the walls. And yet, imagine her sitting close to Margot, trying to share not just a blanket, but a memory. Perhaps she whispered about stories she wanted to write. Perhaps she told Margot about imaginary characters. Perhaps she imagined the color of a coat she once had, or wished she'd had, a color bright enough to stand out in a world where everything had turned gray. Because in the end, Anne's power was her ability to imagine something better, even when trapped in something unbearable. That is the true red coat, a symbol of courage, a symbol of identity, a symbol of light when the world has gone dim. In the camps, everything was taken from her: her home, her comfort, her diary, her health, her sister, her mother, her future. But what the Nazis could never take from Anne was her ability to feel deeply, to observe the world, to find meaning in even the smallest moments. That part of her lived until her final breath. Many survivors later said that Anne looked like she had lost everything after Margot died. Yet even in her final days, she spoke softly. She still cared about the people around her. She still tried to be gentle, in a place where gentleness was nearly impossible. That gentleness, fragile, flickering, but real, is part of the symbolic red coat that history has wrapped around her memory. And so, when we picture Anne in those final moments, we do not need to imagine her only as sick, starving, and cold, though she was all of those things. We can imagine her also as the girl who once wrote about dreams, who once believed in goodness, who once filled the annex with her thoughts and hopes. The red coat stands for the child she was, the young woman she was becoming, and the life she never had the chance to live. It is the color of resistance, not through violence, but through the refusal to let cruelty erase humanity. It is the color of memory, not because history demands it, but because the world chose to remember her in a way that honors her spirit. It is the color of love, not romantic, but the love she held for her family, for her writing, for her dreams, for the world she hoped to grow up in. In the end, the red coat is not about clothing at all. It is about presence, and Anne Frank's presence in history remains vivid, warm, and unmistakably alive. Even in her final days, tired, sick, heartbroken, Anne carried within her a spark that time has never managed to extinguish. That spark is the red coat, still glowing softly across the decades, reminding us that even in humanity's darkest moments, there were lights that refused to go out. 4. The collapse of the Annex, from safety to captivity. Before Anne Frank ever saw the inside of a concentration camp, she lived in a world that felt suspended between fear and routine, between danger and imagination. The secret annex was cramped, tense, and silent, but it was also a place where life, strange, fragile life, continued to unfold. For more than 2 years, its walls held back the outside world, acting as a thin layer of safety between 8 people and the vast machinery of persecution. To understand Anne's final days, we must understand the moment when this world collapsed, the moment when the annex was betrayed, stormed, and emptied by strangers who had no idea how much meaning those rooms contained. The collapse of the annex is more than a historical event. It is a turning point in Anne's story, a thread that unravels everything. Until that moment, the danger had always been abstract. Now it had a face, many faces, many footsteps, many hands, tearing apart the last sanctuary the Frank family had. Imagining that day is like watching a candle gutter in an unexpected gust of wind. One moment there is light, the next the room is plunged into darkness. On the morning of August 4th, 1944, the residents of the annex were going about their usual routine. Quiet work, careful movements, whispered conversations. There was nothing unusual about the day. Nothing that hinted at the fact that by afternoon, everything would be gone. The betrayal remains mysterious even today. Historians debate the details, but what matters for this script is the emotional truth. Someone, for reasons unknown, chose to expose them. And so the annex, once silent and protective, became the stage for its own unraveling. Imagine Anne hearing footsteps, loud ones, not the gentle creaks she'd come to recognize, not the careful steps of helpers, but the heavy boots of officers. Imagine her looking at her father for reassurance and seeing, for the first time, fear he could not hide. Otto Frank had always been the rock of the family, steady even when the world shook. But that day, even he could not steady himself. When the door to the annex was thrown open, time seemed to stop. Everything they had feared, everything they had tried to postpone, suddenly stood in front of them. Anne, who had spent her days imagining life after the war, must have felt as though those dreams shattered instantly, falling like tiny pieces of glass across the floorboards. Yet this moment, terrible as it was, also revealed something profound about the people inside the annex. They behaved with dignity. They cooperated. They did not scream or resist or fall apart. In a strange way, the annex residents were united more strongly than ever in their shared shock, in their shared helplessness. This unity, quiet, exhausted, resilient, softens the edges of the tragedy. When the officers searched the rooms, pulling out drawers, scattering papers, and overturning personal belongings, they were not destroying objects. They were unraveling lives. Among the items they tossed aside was Anne's diary. They thought it had no value, no meaning. They couldn't have known. As the group was led downstairs, each of them carried something different inside. Fear, Anger, confusion, a desperate longing to stay. Anne was old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough to still wonder if somehow it could be fixed. She had always balanced between realism and hope. That day, the balance tipped sharply toward fear. And yet, there was something in her that did not break. The collapse of the annex marked the end of safety, but not the end of Anne's strength. Survivors described her as brave, calm, even oddly composed during those early days of arrest. She tried to comfort others when she herself was unraveling. She tried to help her father and Margot process what was happening, even though she had no way to understand the magnitude of what awaited them. The transport to Westerbork, their first camp, was not a place of death like Auschwitz, but a place of waiting, a limbo, a holding space for human beings caught in a system that did not see them as human. At Westerbork, Anne saw crowds of people, faces worn down by exhaustion, despair, and sickness. She saw children who had lost their parents. She saw parents who had lost themselves. But she did not withdraw. Anne, even in a camp, tried to speak with others. She tried to be helpful, to remain human in a place where humanity was being stripped away, layer by layer. She helped sort batteries. She tried to keep her sister close. She even made quiet jokes with other young people, small flickers of personality in a place designed to suppress it. What is remarkable is not that Anne suffered, everyone did, but that she continued to look around her with observant, empathetic eyes. She was still Anne, even when the annex was gone, still curious, still noticing, still trying to make sense of life. The collapse of the annex is often described in history books as the moment everything ended, but perhaps it is more accurate to say it is the moment everything shifted. The physical world Anne knew was destroyed. Her belongings were taken, her space invaded, her safety crushed. But her inner world, the world that produced her diary, the world that saw beauty in spite of everything, did not disappear overnight. In fact, one could argue that Anne's inner world became more vivid than ever during this time. Deprived of paper and pen, she wrote in her mind. Deprived of privacy, she found moments of reflection in silence. Deprived of freedom, she held on to the tiny acts of kindness she witnessed around her. A shared crust of bread, a whispered blessing, a moment of quiet empathy between strangers. This ability to see light, even thin, flickering light, is what made Anne Frank different. It is what keeps her story alive. And it is what makes the collapse of the annex so powerful. It was not only an ending. It was a painful beginning, one that would lead her to the darkest chapter of her life, but also reveal the quiet courage that would define her legacy. The annex fell, but Anne did not fall with it. Not immediately, not inwardly. The walls broke, but she did not break. Not yet. 5. Westerbork, a camp built on waiting. Before Anne Frank entered the darkest places of her final journey, she passed through a world that was neither free nor yet fully doomed. A world suspended uncomfortably between hope and despair. This world was the transit camp of Westerbork, a place designed not for living, but for waiting. And in that waiting, something quiet but profound happened. Anne began to understand that even in a hollow place, Humanity could flicker like a candle in a draft, fragile yet persistent. Westerbork was not like the stories she had heard whispered about the East. It was cleaner, more orderly, less openly brutal. The prisoners lived in long barracks. They had some routines, some tasks, some sense of days passing. There was no gas chamber here, no smoke, no immediate killing. People were not brought to Westerbork to die. They were brought to be held, to be processed, to be sent elsewhere. That word, elsewhere, hovered over the camp like a dark cloud. Everyone knew what transport meant, even if the details remained blurred by fear. And at Westerbork, Anne encountered people whose lives had been paused indefinitely, people who existed within this anxious middle ground, as though waiting for a verdict that would never come. For the first time in 2 years, Anne saw crowds. She saw hundreds of faces, all shaped by the same uncertainty, the same exhaustion, the same quiet ache of losing everything. Some had been there for months, some for years. Some had arrived only days earlier, still carrying the frantic momentum of their capture. In the annex, Anne had lived in confinement, but it was a confinement that contained familiarity, privacy, and even tiny joys. In Westerbork, she stepped into a sea of strangers, each with a story cut short. She and her family were assigned to the punishment block because they had been found in hiding, a technical violation that placed them lower in the fragile hierarchy of camp life. But even here, among the less privileged, Anne watched as people tried to protect one another. Some shared extra bread. Some whispered news, real or imagined, offering a moment of relief to those around them. Some kept hope alive by clinging to fragments of rumor. Anne herself tried to adapt. She quickly fell into the rhythm of the camp, working long hours sorting batteries in a large workshop. The work was tedious and repetitive, but it gave her something essential: purpose, something to do with her hands, something to focus on besides fear, and perhaps most importantly, something to share with others. In the battery workshop, Anne met girls her age, faces she had never seen before, yet with whom she instantly shared a silent understanding. They talked quietly whenever the guards were not watching. They joked. They exchanged small pieces of their stories. These friendships were fleeting, made in the spaces between tasks and tension, but they mattered. They reminded Anne that she was still part of the world, not merely drifting through it. People remembered her as lively, surprisingly optimistic, even charming. She made others laugh. She spoke rapidly, her energy cutting briefly through the gloom of the barracks. For a moment, it must have felt like being back at school, or on the streets of Amsterdam, or in one of the daydreams she recorded in her diary. But behind her efforts, a shadow lingered. Westerbork was a place where people learned to expect their world to change overnight. Every Tuesday, a list was posted. Names of those who would be sent east. A train, each week, without fail. A train that carried away hundreds at a time. The Tuesday list haunted everyone. Whispers grew louder the closer the day came. People lay awake at night, listening for footsteps, praying they would not hear their names, dreading the moment they might. The camp was quiet on Tuesdays, as if holding its breath. Anne, Margot, and their parents tried to prepare themselves for the inevitable. They had always known that capture meant deportation, but knowing and facing are two different things. Now, with each passing week, the threat pressed more heavily against their minds. Still, Anne tried to be strong for her sister. She comforted Margot when the fear grew too heavy. She held her mother's hand. She watched her father with a mixture of admiration and worry. Otto Frank, who had always seemed steady, was now thinner, quieter, older in a way that had nothing to do with time. Yet it was at Westerbork that Anne's resilience shone most clearly. She was frightened, yes, she was overwhelmed. But she was also still deeply curious about the world around her. She studied the behavior of the guards. She observed the emotional patterns of the people in her barrack. She listened to the stories others told, storing them somewhere deep inside, perhaps imagining how she might one day write them down. One could say that Westerbork was the last place where Anne Frank experienced something resembling community. Even within suffering, there was companionship. Even within chaos, there was structure. Even within despair, there were moments, not many, but a few, of laughter, or shared bread, or kindness. And then came the Tuesday. The Frank family's names were on the list. They had been in Westerbork for only a few weeks, nowhere near long enough to fade into the background, to become invisible, to be forgotten by the system. They were new, and the new ones almost always left first. The knowledge struck them like a blow, but this time there was no room for shock. Everyone in Westerbork knew what departure meant, even if they didn't know the details of the places they were being sent to. They knew they were going to a place from which most people never returned, and yet the deportees packed what little they had in silence, slowly, carefully, not wanting to believe that the moment had come, and yet unable to deny it. When Anne walked toward the cattle car that would take her to Auschwitz, she saw hundreds of people around her, also being loaded into the train, women clutching infants, elderly men with trembling hands, children crying because they did not understand the magnitude of what was happening. She saw so much suffering that it could have made her collapse inward, but instead, something almost defiant ignited within her. Witnesses said she tried to stay brave. She tried to comfort others. She tried to keep Margot close, so her sister would not be alone in the chaos. Even then, even as the world grew darker than ever, Anne refused to abandon her instinct to care. Westerbork was a place built on waiting, but for Anne, it was also a place built on witnessing, on seeing humanity press to its limits, and still somehow finding small grains of hope. When the train doors finally closed, and the last bit of daylight vanished behind iron locks, Anne Frank carried with her not just fear, but memory. The memory of faces who had helped her laugh when laughter seemed impossible. She did not know it, but this would be the last place where she experienced even a fragment of normal human kindness. From here, the journey grew much darker. 6. The train to Auschwitz, a journey without time. On the morning Anne Frank boarded the transport from Westerbork, she stepped into a world where time no longer behaved like something that moved forward. In the tiny, suffocating space of the cattle car, Hours blurred into hours, light into darkness, breath into breath. There were no clocks, no windows that opened, no silence that offered rest, only a constant trembling of wood and iron. As the train rattled deeper into a fate none of its passengers wanted to name aloud. Anne had imagined many things in her life, the world she created in her stories, the future she hoped to shape, the dreams she had whispered into the pages of her diary when the annex had grown too small. But nothing in her imagination had prepared her for the inside of a deportation train. There was no room to sit comfortably, no room to lie down, no space for privacy or dignity, or even clean air. Still, amid the crush of bodies, Anne clung to her family. Margot stayed close beside her, their shoulders touching, their breaths warming the same thin slice of air. Otto Frank stood as steadily as he could, shielding his daughters from the shoves of the guards. Edith Frank tried to comfort a crying child who was not her own, because even here she could not bear to ignore suffering. The car was dim. Slits in the wooden boards allowed only thin strands of light to enter, turning the faces around Anne into shapes and shadows. Sometimes she caught glimpses of fields, trees, or distant buildings flickering by, but these moments were brief, gone before she could gather them into meaning. All she could do was endure. The journey lasted days, many days. No one was told how long. No one dared ask. In that moving darkness, time became something Anne had to measure by human signs, by the sound of someone collapsing from exhaustion, by the rising hum of panic when water ran out, by the quiet sobbing that filled the hours when night returned. People fainted, some prayed, some clung to loved ones, some tried to bargain with a world that no longer listened. Yet within the claustrophobia of the car, Anne found something unexpected, a fragile sense of unity. Survivors later described how she spoke to others, trying to lift their spirits. She shared small bits of her life, stories of Amsterdam, of the annex, of her hope to one day become a writer. In this way, she filled the choking silence with something warmer than despair. For a moment, despite the cruelty of their circumstances, she made people remember who they had been before: a mother, a teacher, a musician, a child. Even in such a place, Anne's presence had a brightness to it, muted now, constrained, but not extinguished. The train stopped occasionally, jerking violently enough to knock people sideways. Each time, hope rippled through the prisoners. Maybe this is the end of the journey. But outside, they heard only shouts, doors slamming, boots on gravel. No one was allowed out. The train would start again, and each time it did, the dread grew greater. Anne tried not to think about what waited ahead. She tried to picture something better. The sound of summer in Amsterdam, the crisp freshness of a morning in the annex, the way she used to listen to the bells of the Westertoren Tower. She whispered to Margot about the things they would do when the war ended, even though neither of them believed it as fully as they once had. They held each other through the fear. At some point, no one knew how many hours or days had passed. The air in the car shifted. People began to sense that they were nearing something. The train slowed. The sounds outside changed. There were more voices now, sharper, angrier, dogs barking, women gasping, children clinging to their parents with renewed panic. As the train shuddered to its final halt, silence fell inside the car, a heavy, trembling silence. Then came the metallic scrape of locks, the sudden glare of daylight, the shouting of SS guards, and the screams. The doors were thrown open so abruptly that many prisoners stumbled backward, covering their eyes from the unexpected brightness. Anne felt the cold air rush in, cleaner than anything she had breathed in days, yet colder, almost cruel in its clarity. She blinked against the light. Outside, she saw rows of barbed wire, watchtowers, floodlights, endless lines of exhausted figures moving like shadows through the yard. And beyond all that, she saw the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was a place that looked nothing like the world she had imagined. It was vast, stretching further than her mind could grasp. The sky above it felt heavy, as though the very air carried sorrow. People were forced out of the car, pushed, shouted at, beaten if they hesitated. Families clung to one another, desperate not to be separated. Anne clutched Margot's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. They tried to stay near their parents, moving through the chaos as a single, fragile unit. The noise around them was overwhelming. Commands yelled in German, dogs snarling, the sound of weeping. Guards marched down the line, pointing left, right, dividing people with a flick of the wrist. The meaning of these directions was not yet clear, but the consequences would soon reveal themselves. Anne felt the dryness in her throat deepen. Something inside her whispered that this was the real beginning of the nightmare, the part hidden, even from the whispered rumors of Westerbork. Still, she kept her head high. She tried to appear brave for Margot. She tried, even then, to absorb what she saw, the faces, the movements, the strange machinery of terror unfolding around her. Later, people who survived that arrival recalled seeing two teenage girls stepping down from the train, thin, exhausted, but holding on to each other with a kind of steadfast calm. Those girls were Anne and Margot Frank. As they passed through the lines, through the smoke-scented air and the cries of thousands, they could not know that the most harrowing chapter of their short lives was about to begin. But they also could not know that even here, in the darkest place humanity had built, moments of tenderness, courage, and sisterhood would still shape the hours they had left. For now, the train doors closed behind them, and Auschwitz opened. 7. The first days in Auschwitz, a world reduced to survival. The moment Anne stepped beyond the selection line, she felt the air change. It was colder here, stripped of anything familiar, as if even the wind had forgotten how to carry warmth. The camp stretched out in front of her like a vast, colorless plain. Rows of wooden barracks, long coils of barbed wire, guard towers standing sharp against a sky that seemed too big, too empty. The ground beneath her feet was a mixture of mud and gravel that clung to her shoes. The smell was heavy, difficult to identify, a mixture of smoke, sweat, and something darker, something that made instinct stir uneasily in her chest. She held on to Margot's hand as they moved in a tight cluster with other women and girls, guided by shouts that echoed across the yard. The guards ushered them toward a building where their identities would be erased, not symbolically, but literally. As the door closed behind them, Anne felt the temperature drop again, the cold settling into her bones. It was here, under harsh lights and watchful eyes, that the process began. First, the prisoners were ordered to undress. Anne hesitated only for a heartbeat, then forced herself to comply, her fingers trembling as she peeled away the last pieces of normal life she owned. Around her, women covered their faces, but there was nowhere to hide. Privacy vanished with the clothes that fell to the floor. In those moments, Anne learned a new form of vulnerability, one that struck deeper than fear. Their hair was shaved next. The sound of the clippers buzzed like an insect trapped in a closed room, relentless and indifferent. When Anne's turn came, she sat rigid as the guard roughly pushed the device across her scalp. Fallen strands scattered around her feet like pieces of her identity returning to the earth. Margot watched, her expression filled with a kind of quiet sorrow, and then she sat down for her own turn. When it was over, the sisters touched their heads gently, almost in disbelief. They barely recognized each other. Afterward, the prisoners were given rough uniforms, thin dresses, wooden shoes that rubbed the skin raw, and a scrap of fabric with a number. Anne's number was a row of digits unlike any she had known. It felt strange in her hand, small yet heavy. An object that announced a truth she tried not to think about. Here, she was no longer Anne Frank, the girl who dreamed of being a writer. Here, she was a number. Outside, they were herded again, this time toward the women's barracks. The wooden building loomed in front of them like a wounded beast, sagging under the weight of too many lives pressed inside. When Anne walked through the door, the smell of damp straw and unwashed bodies hit her like a wave. Inside, rows of triple-tiered bunks filled the long room. Some planks were cracked, many were stained. The air felt thick, as if too many breaths had been trapped inside for too long. A few women glanced up when the new arrivals entered, their expressions a mixture of pity, exhaustion, and distant curiosity. A prisoner who served as a block elder pointed Anne and Margot toward an upper bunk. Climbing up was difficult, her legs still weak from the journey, but Margot pulled herself up first and extended a hand to her sister. When Anne settled beside her, the straw beneath her shifted, prickling her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Their silence was not emptiness. It was comprehension, the kind that stemmed from shock. As night fell, Auschwitz grew louder. Orders were shouted in the yard. Dogs barked. Somewhere, a whistle blew. Every sound carried a sharpness that made Anne's muscles tense, as though the darkness had amplified every threat. And yet the barracks itself hummed with quiet voices, soft murmurs between mothers and daughters, whispered prayers, breathy sobs that people tried to suppress. Anne lay awake beside Margot, listening. She felt her sister's thin body trembling in the cold, so she wrapped an arm around her. the same way Margot often had in the annex when night fears kept Anne from sleeping. Here, that simple gesture felt even more necessary. Their mother, Edith, was placed in a different section, and Anne felt a pang when she realized how much she missed her presence already. Even Otto, their anchor through every hardship, had been sent to the men's camp. The Franks were together, yet separated by fences and walls, close enough to feel the pull of each other's existence, but too far to touch. In the dark, Anne whispered, "We will hold on, Margot. Together. We have to." Margot squeezed her hand. Yes, together. The next morning came without gentle light or soft waking. A whistle blew before dawn, sharp and merciless. Everyone scrambled from their bunks, shivering, exhausted. Roll call followed, a long, brutal ritual where prisoners stood in the freezing air for hours, motionless, while guards counted and recounted them. The cold bit through Anne's clothes, and she could barely feel her fingers. She thought of Amsterdam then, the crisp morning air, the way sunlight filtered through leaves along the canals. The contrast was so stark that her breath caught in her chest. That world felt impossibly far away. Work assignments came next. Some women were sent to fields, some to sorting sheds, some to carry heavy stones until their backs ached. Anne and Margot were temporarily assigned to labor near the barracks, clearing debris and moving materials. It was exhausting, but they were together, and that alone was a lifeline. Throughout the day, Anne noticed things she tried to store quietly in her mind. The way some prisoners helped each other steal moments of rest, the way others shared scraps of food, the way small acts of kindness bloomed in the cracks of terror. Even here, humanity refused to be extinguished. That night, the sisters returned to their bunk, with blistered hands and shaking legs. But they had made it through the day, and that was something. As they lay down, pressed together for warmth, Anne felt the faintest trace of something she had not allowed herself in the hours since the train doors opened. Not hope, but endurance, a steady flame that refused to go out, even in the coldest darkness. 8 small acts of courage, the human threads holding Anne together. In the days that followed their arrival, Anne began to understand that Auschwitz was a world defined by extremes: extreme hunger, extreme cold, extreme uncertainty, but also extreme contrasts in human behavior. Cruelty lived here certainly, but so did quiet bravery. And it was these small, nearly invisible threads of courage that helped her endure the unfolding nightmare. Each morning began with the same harsh whistle, the same scramble from the bunks, the same biting air that hit Anne like icy needles. The roll calls felt endless, and Anne often swayed on her feet, trying to keep her mind focused so she wouldn't collapse. Margot, standing beside her, would shift her weight subtly to lean against Anne, and Anne would lean back, each sister anchoring the other in place. This exchange, simple as it was, became one of their first acts of courage, choosing not to let the other fall. During the work hours, Anne noticed that some prisoners moved like shadows, quietly helping those around them. A woman with graying hair would gently guide the younger girls into positions where the guards were less likely to notice if they paused for breath. A tall woman with sharp cheekbones used her own body to block the view when someone needed a moment to wipe sweat or tears from their face. Anne began to realize that courage in Auschwitz did not look like the stories she had once read. It did not roar. It whispered. One morning, Anne felt herself stumbling during work, her vision blurring. She hadn't eaten more than a crust of bread the night before, and her stomach ached with an emptiness that spread up into her chest. As she paused to steady her breathing, a hand brushed hers, not grabbing, not drawing attention, just passing something small into her palm. A crumb, hardly more than a bite. When Anne looked up, she saw an older woman glance at her only briefly before turning away. The woman's eyes said everything. "Take it, quickly, eat it before anyone sees." Anne swallowed the crumb so fast she barely tasted it, but the warmth it created inside her lasted for hours. That tiny piece of food, barely measurable, was a spark of kindness, and in this place, that was more precious than gold. As days passed, Anne found herself drawn to these silent acts of humanity, noticing how they connected people like invisible threads. One afternoon, while carrying wooden planks with Margot, Anne spotted a prisoner in the corner of the yard, struggling to lift a heavy beam. Her arms shook violently, and she looked close to fainting. A guard watched from a distance. Anne knew she should keep moving. Any attention, even helpful attention, could draw punishment. But then Margot gently touched her elbow, a wordless gesture, and together the sisters maneuvered closer. With practiced subtlety, they shifted their path, so the guard's line of sight was blocked for just a few moments. It was enough. Another prisoner hurried forward and lifted the beam before the guard noticed anything wrong. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. Courage, Anne realized, was not always in daring actions. Sometimes it lived in a simple decision to care, even when caring was dangerous. As evening fell, the camp transformed again. Shadows lengthened across the yard, making the fences look like black skeletons reaching toward the sky. Smoke drifted from chimneys in slow, heavy coils. Anne watched it sometimes with a strange numbness, her mind refusing to accept fully what those plumes meant. Inside the barracks, after the guards completed their inspections, a different quiet settled. The quiet of people trying to reclaim some small part of their humanity. Women whispered to one another. Some held hands, sharing warmth. Others hummed barely audible tunes from memories of home. Margot often spoke softly to Anne during these hours, reminding her of the annex, of the chestnut tree that used to glow golden in the sunlight. Anne would close her eyes and picture it, its branches stretching across the sky like an embrace. The memory made the freezing nights feel just a little bit less sharp. One of the most unexpected comforts came from a Polish woman named Danuta, who shared their bunk row. Danuta had soft eyes that seemed tired in every direction, but she always found a way to look at Anne and Margot with kindness. One night, she whispered, "We survive by holding on to something, anything. What do you hold on to?" Anne hesitated. She did not want to seem childish, yet she answered honestly. "Words," she said, "stories, thoughts. I try to keep them alive inside me." Danuta nodded slowly. "Good. Words survive longer than flesh." Anne thought about that for a long time. She had no diary here, no pen, no paper, but her mind still wrote silent sentences, descriptions, memories. She would compose stories in her head as she lay on the rough straw, whispering some of them to Margot, letting others live silently inside her thoughts. Those internal words were another kind of courage. They kept her connected to the part of herself that Auschwitz could not erase. As the days passed, Anne also began to understand the unspoken signals among prisoners. The way someone might tug their sleeve to warn of an approaching guard, or the way they passed tiny scraps of information about weather, movements, or new rules. These signals were a network of survival, a fragile system built on trust. Anne learned to read them quickly. She learned when to step forward, when to step back, when to speak, when to stay silent. Her sharp mind, the one that had once filled pages in a hidden attic, adapted swiftly. Still, hardships grew. Food rations shrank. Work demands increased. Illness spread easily. Anne saw women collapse, sometimes disappearing overnight. Each time, she felt something inside her tighten. Not despair exactly, but a deep, aching awareness of fragility. Yet every morning, despite exhaustion, she rose with Margot. She walked through the cold. She stood through roll call. She worked. She moved. She observed. She held on. And on many nights, when they returned to the bunk and curled against each other for warmth, Anne felt the same fragile truth whisper through her mind. We made it through today. Sometimes survival was an act of bravery. Sometimes it was simply an act of continuing. And here, in the bleakest of places, Anne continued. 9. Illness spreads. The slow unraveling of strength. Illness in Auschwitz did not arrive like a sudden storm. It drifted in quietly, like a cold fog, but seeped into every breath, every bone, every corner of the barracks. At first, Anne barely noticed it. She told herself the coughs around her were temporary, that the shivers felt by the women in their bunks were simply from the freezing nights. But slowly, inevitably, illness revealed itself as a silent predator, patient, tireless, and merciless. The winter that crept into the camp was harsher than Anne had ever imagined. The air tasted metallic and sharp, and the ground froze solid beneath her thin shoes. Each morning, when she woke, she felt the cold gripping her chest before she took even a single breath. Margot huddled close beside her at night, but their thin blankets and fragile bodies could only hold back so much of the chill. As days passed, the coughing grew louder. It started as soft sounds in the dark, someone clearing their throat, someone gasping. Then it became relentless, hacking fits that echoed through the wooden walls. The barracks shook with it, as though the entire building were breathing in ragged intervals. Anne watched as faces around her grew paler, thinner, more hollow. The women who once managed a faint smile or a whispered joke now lay curled on their bunks, too weak to rise. Some disappeared without a word, taken to infirmaries where no one returned from. Others simply did not wake up. Illness moved with a terrifying ease. Food was scarce. Clean water was rarer still. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and broken. Every condition in the camp was crafted for sickness to thrive. Anne tried to hold on to her strength. She forced herself to eat every small ration given to her, even when her stomach twisted with hunger. She tried to keep moving during the day, knowing that stillness invited weakness. But even she began to feel the subtle signs, her limbs growing heavier, her breath catching more often, a deep exhaustion pulling at her from within. Margot noticed it before Anne admitted it. One morning, as they stood for roll call under a sky the color of faded steel, Margot leaned close and whispered, "You're shaking." Anne tried to steady her hands, but the tremble continued. "It's just the cold," she murmured. But Margot's eyes said she did not believe that. Still, Anne pushed forward. She reminded herself of the people around her, of the tiny acts of courage she had witnessed, and she told herself she would hold on just a little longer. Yet the sickness spreading through the camp began to surround her more closely. One evening, as she returned to the barracks after a long day of work, she saw a young woman collapse near the entrance. Several others rushed to lift her, but the guards shouted, ordering them back. The woman lay on the ground, gasping for air, her eyes wide with fear. Anne watched, unable to move, her heart pounding with helplessness. Eventually, the woman was dragged away by two prisoners assigned to remove the sick. No one spoke about it afterward. The silence that followed was heavier than the cold. Later that night, as Anne lay in her bunk, she listened to the breathing around her. Some breaths were shallow, barely audible. Others rattled painfully. Margot's breathing was soft but steady. Anne closed her eyes, trying to focus on that one sound, letting it anchor her to something familiar. But sleep did not come easily. She kept waking, sometimes from coughing, sometimes from chills, sometimes from nightmares that blurred into reality. In the thin slivers of rest she managed, her dreams were filled with images of the annex, of warm mornings, with sunlight drifting through curtains, of laughter echoing through the small rooms. She would open her eyes and find herself staring at the dark wooden boards above her, a reminder of where she truly was. One morning, Anne noticed that Margot's cheeks were flushed, not with warmth, but with fever. Margot tried to brush it off, insisting she was fine, but Anne could feel the heat radiating from her when they pressed close at night. "Maybe it's just a cold," Margot whispered, but Anne's heart clenched. She had seen enough illness in the camp to know that this was not something to ignore. She tried to take on more of the work, to let Margot conserve her strength. Whenever possible, she shielded her sister during labor tasks, stepping in quickly when Margot faltered. The guards rarely noticed. They were often distracted, shouting orders or pacing along the edges of the work groups. But Anne's efforts came at a cost. Her own strength dwindled faster. The balance between the sisters began to shift. They had always leaned on each other, shared responsibilities, offered comfort. But now, Anne felt herself slipping under the weight of survival. She remembered Danuda's words about holding on to something, anything. And so Anne held on to Margot. Every day, every hour, she pushed herself to keep her sister safe. Even as her own body weakened, the cold grew sharper. Frost formed along the window frames of the barracks. The water buckets froze overnight. When Anne tried to drink, the liquid stung her throat like needles. Food rations shrank again. Life became a fragile cycle. Wake, freeze, work, cough, shiver, sleep, repeat. Yet in the middle of this endless gray, Anne still found brief moments of warmth. Not physical warmth, but emotional warmth that flickered like a candle against the darkness. A woman shared a scrap of cloth to help wrap Margot's shoulders. Someone whispered a prayer they had memorized as a child. A younger girl, no older than Anne herself, hummed a lullaby during the night. The soft sound drifting through the barracks like a fragile reminder that somewhere, outside these walls, tenderness still existed. But even these gentle moments could not fully protect them. Anne's cough worsened. Her energy faded. She felt dizzy more often. Sometimes during work, the world tilted, and she would have to lean on Margot or Danuta to regain her balance. Illness was not just a physical battle. It was a slow unraveling of hope. Anne began to notice something she could not ignore. Her thoughts were becoming heavier, slower. She found it harder to compose the quiet stories in her mind that had once comforted her. She still tried. She still whispered tiny sentences to herself at night. But the words sometimes slipped away before she could hold them. That frightened her more than the coughing. Words had been her lifeline. Losing them felt like losing a part of herself. One night, when the moon cast a pale glow across the barracks floor, Anne sat upright in her bunk, shaking. Margot stirred beside her, immediately noticing. "Annie, what's wrong?" she murmured. Anne took a moment before answering, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to disappear." Margot wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "You won't," she whispered. "I'm here. We hold on together." Anne closed her eyes, letting those words settle inside her, fragile but comforting. Still, the illness around them deepened, and the camp grew quieter. Not peaceful, but quiet in a way that signaled loss. Anne understood that they were entering the harshest stretch yet, and though she could feel her strength fading, she continued to push forward each day, clinging to the threads of courage that still bound her to those around her. Threads woven from kindness, memory, and the bond she shared with Margot. Illness might weaken her body, but it had not yet taken her will. And as long as that remained, Anne held on. 10. The shadows of fear, living with the unknown. The days in Bergen-Belsen had taken on a rhythm of fear and uncertainty, a rhythm that Anne could not escape. Each morning brought the possibility of a new tragedy, another friend gone, another body taken, another voice silenced in the silent march of illness and despair. She could not predict what the day would hold. The uncertainty clung to her like a second skin, cold and oppressive, wrapping around her with every step she took. Even small acts, once simple and mundane, now carried weight and danger. Fetching water from the communal taps was no longer just a chore. It was a calculated risk. One wrong movement, one misstep, could draw the wrath of the guards or invite the attention of disease. Anne moved carefully, always aware of her surroundings, always alert, as though the slightest lapse might cost her life. The very act of living felt precarious. Food was scarcer than ever. The meager rations they were given seemed to shrink in their hands, transforming the simple act of eating into a strategic calculation. Each crumb was precious, each sip of thin soup a lifeline. Anne tried to share with Margot, trying to give her sister more than her fair share, yet always feeling the pangs of hunger gnawing at her own stomach. Hunger was no longer a feeling. It was a constant companion, whispering reminders of fragility and mortality. The barracks were crowded, suffocating with the press of bodies, the stench of illness, and the quiet despair that filled every corner. Anne could hear the coughs echoing down the rows of bunks, a relentless reminder of the disease spreading unchecked. She tried to focus on the small things, the soft rustle of someone shifting in a blanket, the quiet sigh of a child falling asleep. But even these sounds carried a hollow, haunting quality in the shadow of suffering. Anne noticed how the camp seemed to shrink, not physically, but in spirit. Spaces that once might have felt communal, shared, or even protective, now felt claustrophobic, as if the walls themselves were closing in, pressing down on the already burdened souls within. The air felt heavy with the weight of anticipation, each person bracing for an outcome they could not control. In the corner of her mind, Anne whispered a wish that somehow, somewhere, she could escape this relentless tension. But she knew it was a wish with little chance of fulfillment. Despite the terror and uncertainty, Anne clung to the flickers of hope she could find. Sometimes it came in fleeting gestures, a whispered joke from a neighboring girl, a hand extended in quiet solidarity, a small offering of bread or soup shared in secret. These small acts were fragile lights, glimmers of humanity in a place designed to strip it away. They reminded Anne of her life before the camp, of the warmth and comfort of her home in Amsterdam, the security of the secret annex, the voices of her family speaking softly in the night. Each memory was a treasure, fragile yet unyielding, a fragile shield against the relentless fear around her. Fear in the camp was not always immediate or visible. It lingered in shadows, in pauses, in the silent spaces between events. Anne became acutely aware of how quickly the atmosphere could shift. A sudden shout from a guard, the approach of a transport truck, the disappearance of someone in the night. Each incident sent ripples of dread through the barracks, a reminder that stability was an illusion, and that nothing, not even her bond with Margot, was guaranteed. Every breath was measured, every movement calculated. Living became a delicate balance between courage and caution. Even as fear persisted, Anne sought solace in her memories and in the fragments of normalcy she could create. She imagined herself writing again, carefully tracing letters in her mind that might never reach the pages of her diary. She imagined herself listening to the faint sounds of music carried on the wind, or the murmur of conversation that once filled the rooms of the secret annex. These imagined moments were brief refuges from the reality that pressed on her from every side. They were reminders that a part of her, her intellect, her spirit, her imagination, remained untouched by the cruelty around her. But the shadows of fear were relentless. The presence of death was constant, a near tangible force in the crowded barracks. Anne saw it in the faces of those who had lost the fight against illness, in the eyes of children too weak to lift themselves from the straw, in the silence that followed each removal to the infirmary. Each passing body, each extinguished life, left its mark on the community, an invisible residue of loss that clung to the survivors. The fear of joining that silent procession weighed on Anne more heavily than any cold or hunger. At night, the fear became more acute. Darkness magnified every sound, the groan of someone turning in their bunk, the distant cough of a fevered child, the shuffle of tired feet across the wooden floors. Sleep was intermittent, restless, haunted by both memories and imagined threats. Anne lay in her bunk, listening to Margot's quiet breathing, trying to draw strength from her sister's presence. The proximity offered comfort, but it did not erase the creeping awareness that tomorrow could bring more loss, more suffering, more darkness. Each night was a battle to retain hope, a fragile struggle against despair that seemed to press in from all sides. Anne's reflections during these nights often returned to the meaning of life and survival. She thought about the fragility of human existence, the randomness of death, the resilience required to endure. Even in her weakest moments, she contemplated the resilience of those around her, the courage displayed in small, almost imperceptible acts of kindness, solidarity, and resistance. These reflections were her quiet rebellion against the fear surrounding her, a reminder that while they could not control the camp, they could control the way they responded to it, the humanity they preserved within themselves. Despite her fragile state, Anne's mind remained sharp, probing the nature of the world around her. She noticed the patterns in illness, the ways people reacted under stress, the subtle codes of communication that emerged in whispered words and brief gestures. Fear could not silence her completely. In fact, it heightened her awareness, sharpened her senses, and pushed her to pay attention in ways she had never imagined. Every sound, every movement, every pause was a signal, a fragment of understanding in a world that seemed otherwise incomprehensible. And yet, even as Anne navigated the shadows of fear, she clung to hope, a hope that seemed almost defiant in its persistence. It was fragile, like the flame of a candle threatened by the wind, but it burned nevertheless. She held on to it with every ounce of strength she possessed, drawing from it the courage to face each day, to endure each moment of uncertainty, and to preserve a sense of self amid the darkness. The shadows were long, and the fear pervasive, but Anne's spirit remained, quietly, courageously, unbroken. 11. Acts of courage in the midst of despair. In the dimly lit barracks of Bergen-Belsen, courage had taken on a new meaning. Far removed from heroic battles or public displays of valor. Here, courage meant survival, small, quiet, and often invisible to the world outside the camp. Anne Frank and those around her had learned that every decision carried weight, and that even the simplest actions could be acts of defiance against the suffocating forces of fear and oppression. One of the most profound demonstrations of courage was simply waking up each day, rising from the thin straw bedding, stretching weary limbs, and facing a world where death could arrive at any moment required a fortitude that is difficult to comprehend. Anne observed how the smallest gestures, such as helping a fellow prisoner retrieve a piece of bread, could provide a sense of control and human dignity in a situation designed to strip it away. These acts were often unnoticed by anyone outside the barracks, but they resonated profoundly within the tight-knit community struggling to survive. Anne's courage manifested in her interactions with others, particularly her younger sister, Margot. The sisters leaned on one another for comfort, sharing whispers of reassurance when the sounds of coughing, groaning, and the distant toll of camp bells threatened to overwhelm their spirits. Anne often went out of her way to protect Margot from despair, offering her the little food she had, or encouraging her to find fleeting moments of hope in conversations or memories. In these small acts, courage became intertwined with love, a powerful, sustaining force in a place that seemed designed to extinguish both. Even within the barracks, Anne noticed how courage inspired unexpected solidarity. Prisoners who were strangers just days ago would share pieces of information about approaching guards, offer their bedding to the sick, or quietly organize to ensure everyone had a place to sit or lie down. The rules of fear dictated that survival often depended on self-interest. Yet here was evidence of collective bravery, a subtle rebellion against the environment's relentless cruelty. Anne marveled at the capacity of people to maintain their humanity under unimaginable strain, learning that courage was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, steadfast, and deeply relational. Anne's courage was also evident in her inner world. Despite the surrounding chaos, she continued to reflect, to imagine, and to plan for a future that might never come. She held her diary close as a repository of her thoughts, her fears, and her dreams, a testament to the belief that words could outlive the immediate horrors. Writing became a form of resistance. It was a way to assert her identity, her intellect, and her moral vision in a place that sought to erase all individuality. Each entry was an act of courage, a declaration that even in the shadow of despair, her voice mattered. Amidst the fear and hunger, small acts of playfulness also emerged as expressions of courage. Children would whisper jokes or play subtle games that required attentiveness and cleverness. Adults joined in when they could, fostering moments of levity that reminded them of life beyond the barbed wire. Anne, in particular, cherished these moments, realizing that humor and imagination were tools of survival. They allowed her and others to reclaim a sense of agency, even if only for a brief instant, in a world dominated by unpredictability and danger. Another dimension of courage was the ability to confront the inevitability of death without succumbing entirely to despair. Anne witnessed countless lives extinguished by illness, malnutrition, and exposure, and yet she resisted allowing fear to define her every action. In the presence of illness, she would offer comfort to those suffering, lend a listening ear, or silently pray for relief. These gestures required a profound internal strength, acknowledging the fragility of life without losing one's compassion is an often overlooked form of heroism. Even simple acts of cleanliness became symbolic of courage. With limited water and harsh living conditions, maintaining personal hygiene was nearly impossible. Yet Anne observed prisoners doing what they could to preserve a sense of dignity. Washing faces, combing hair, or carefully tending to clothing became subtle acts of resistance. They demonstrated an enduring commitment to humanity in a setting where the individual had been reduced to a number. These small routines reminded Anne that life could be honored, even in circumstances designed to strip it away. Courage also presented itself in acts of advocacy. Prisoners would sometimes intercede on behalf of others, negotiating with guards, or distributing scarce resources in ways that challenged both fear and hierarchy. Anne observed and learned from these gestures, understanding that courage was not only about protecting oneself, but also about standing for others, even when the odds were overwhelmingly against success. In these moments, Anne saw the capacity of ordinary people to act heroically, not with weapons or power, but with moral clarity and empathy. Anne's imagination itself became a source of courage. She envisioned herself as an author, a historian, a witness to the human condition. By projecting herself into this future, she created a space beyond the camp's confines, a mental sanctuary where hope could flourish. Even when food was scarce, illness widespread, and death looming, she continued to dream, reflecting on what the world might look like after the war. In doing so, Anne demonstrated that courage could exist within the mind, in the quiet determination to hold on to hope and envision life beyond suffering. Perhaps most poignantly, Anne's courage was intertwined with a refusal to let the inhumanity of the camp define her character. She wrote about morality, kindness, and the beauty of life, insisting in her diary that despite everything, people had the capacity for goodness. This perspective was a radical act in a place defined by cruelty. It required immense bravery to maintain optimism and ethical reflection, while surrounded by relentless despair. Through her words, Anne taught that courage could be intellectual, emotional, and moral, all at once, sustaining both herself and those who would one day read her diary. Ultimately, courage in Bergen-Belsen was not a single heroic act, but a mosaic of small, sustained efforts to endure and to protect humanity within oneself and others. Anne's bravery was woven into her daily choices, offering comfort, writing despite fear, imagining a world beyond the camp, and holding on to hope amidst suffering. These acts, seemingly modest, collectively became profound acts of resistance and survival. In witnessing and practicing these forms of courage, Anne's story transcends the particular horrors of her final days, offering a timeless lesson. Courage can flourish even in the most desolate circumstances, and the human spirit can endure, quietly and powerfully, against the darkest of odds. 12. Flickers of hope amid the darkness. Even in the oppressive confines of Bergen-Belsen, moments of hope flickered like tiny stars in a night sky heavy with despair. For Anne Frank, hope was both fragile and necessary, a lifeline she clung to amidst the pervasive fear, starvation, and disease that defined the camp. It was not a hope for immediate liberation, nor was it naive. It was instead a careful, deliberate holding onto the idea that life, in some form, could endure beyond the immediate horrors. One source of hope came from human connection. Anne observed how relationships, even fleeting ones, offered small rays of light in the dark. Prisoners whispered words of encouragement, shared morsels of food, or simply held each other's hands during moments of despair. These gestures, though tiny, were profound affirmations of life and solidarity. For Anne, seeing someone else survive, even momentarily, reinforced her own will to continue living. It was in these connections that the human spirit shone most brightly, reminding her that she was not entirely alone. Another source of hope emerged through reflection and memory. Anne often recalled life before the war, before the hiding, before the camps, moments of family, laughter, and normalcy. She remembered the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of her home, the small freedoms that had once seemed ordinary. In recalling these memories, Anne created mental spaces of safety and comfort, enabling her to survive the psychological strain of the camp. Memory became a form of hope, a reminder that life had been and could one day be beautiful again. Anne also found hope in learning and observation. Despite the barrenness of the camp, she watched the changing seasons, the birds that occasionally flew overhead, and the pattern of sunlight filtering through the sparse barracks windows. These small elements of the natural world reminded her of life's persistence beyond the immediate human suffering. Even the harsh winter days brought lessons of resilience, as snow melted and new buds appeared in the spring. Through this lens, Anne found a rhythm in the world that continued regardless of human cruelty, a subtle but sustaining hope. Acts of creative expression were another powerful source of hope. Anne's diary, her constant companion, became a canvas for imagination and self-expression. She wrote about dreams of becoming a writer, of telling her story to the world, and of the possibility that her words could survive, even if she did not. In articulating these hopes, Anne transformed despair into something purposeful. Writing was an act of preservation, both of memory and of self, and it allowed her to envision a future where life, creativity, and human insight endured beyond the camp's boundaries. Hope also manifested in shared humor and play. Even in Bergen-Belsen, prisoners found moments to whisper jokes, play subtle games, or recall funny stories from the past. Anne took part in these fleeting instances, realizing that laughter could provide psychological relief and a reminder of humanity. In a place designed to strip away individuality, the ability to laugh or smile, however briefly, was an act of defiance. It affirmed that the human spirit could endure in small, astonishing ways, even amid profound suffering. Spirituality, too, provided Anne with moments of hope. She pondered questions of morality, the presence of good and evil, and the possibility of divine justice. While never overtly religious in practice, she reflected on the concept of a moral universe, where acts of kindness and courage could ripple beyond the immediate moment. These reflections offered her a framework for interpreting the chaos around her, and reinforced the belief that ethical living remained possible, even in a world dominated by cruelty. Hope was also sustained through observing courage in others. Anne noticed fellow prisoners who, despite sickness or starvation, helped someone weaker, shared their portion of food, or comforted the grieving. These acts were living proof that human decency persisted, and they inspired her own actions. Witnessing such bravery reaffirmed her belief in the potential for goodness, creating a moral anchor amidst the chaos. Anne's hope extended to the future of humanity as well. She imagined a world beyond the war, one where oppression, fear, and hatred could be replaced by understanding, compassion, and justice. These visions were more than daydreams. They were a mental strategy for survival. By focusing on possibilities rather than solely on the horrors surrounding her, Anne preserved a vital spark that sustained her through the most harrowing days of her life. Even small daily routines contributed to hope. Organizing her meager belongings, keeping her diary clean, and attending to personal hygiene were ways of asserting control over a world designed to deny autonomy. These acts, seemingly mundane, represented a refusal to surrender entirely to despair. Each completed task was a quiet victory, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, life could be ordered, meaningful, and above all, enduring. Perhaps most importantly, hope was fueled by Anne's reflections on the human capacity to remember and bear witness. She understood that her story, if preserved, could serve as testimony to those who perished and as a guide for future generations. In nurturing this awareness, Anne found a profound purpose that transcended her immediate suffering. Her hope was not only personal, but communal, extending beyond herself to the collective memory of humanity. Even as illness and deprivation sapped her physical strength, Anne's mind remained a sanctuary where hope could flourish. She envisioned herself surviving, telling her story, and seeing the world renewed. These mental exercises were not illusions. They were strategies for maintaining morale, mental health, and a sense of identity in an environment designed to strip both away. Through them, Anne demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. In the end, hope in Bergen-Belsen was not a constant flame, but a fragile, flickering presence, sustained by memory, observation, creativity, spirituality, and human connection. For Anne Frank, hope was a deliberate choice each day, a decision to find meaning, assert humanity, and envision a future beyond immediate suffering. In these flickers, she demonstrated that even in the darkest, most dehumanizing circumstances, the human spirit has the capacity to endure, inspire, and illuminate paths forward. Through her reflections, actions, and dreams, Anne's hope became a guiding light, both for herself and for all who would one day read her words, reminding the world that even in the depths of despair, it's possible to hold on to a vision of life, kindness, and possibility. 13. The end and the echo of a voice. As the days turned to weeks in the harsh, overcrowded environment of Bergen-Belsen, Anne Frank's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and disease took their toll on her frail body. And yet, even in these final days, the inner world she had cultivated through reflection, writing, and observation remained luminous. She clung to the remnants of hope, the fragments of memory, and the courage she had carefully nurtured through unimaginable suffering. The world around her had become increasingly chaotic, yet within her diary and her mind, she maintained a realm where humanity, beauty, and possibility persisted. Anne's awareness of mortality was unavoidable. The faces of those around her, friends and strangers alike, were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow with the reality of impending death. She witnessed daily how the virus of despair spread as quickly as the physical illnesses, and she felt the looming presence of her own fragility. Yet even amid this acute awareness, Anne's mind remained engaged, curious, and thoughtful. She observed the behaviors of those around her, the acts of kindness, the quiet acts of selfishness, and the small rituals that prisoners develop to retain a sense of identity and dignity. Each observation was a reminder that life's nuances did not vanish even in the shadow of death. Despite the suffocating confines of the camp, Anne's imagination continued to flourish. She often thought of stories she would tell, worlds she would create, and experiences she would share beyond the walls of her confinement. In these imaginings, she saw herself walking in gardens, hearing the laughter of children, and feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. Images that now seemed almost impossible, yet were vivid and sustaining. Writing had become more than a hobby or a distraction. It was a lifeline, a means of asserting her existence, and a declaration that her voice mattered. Through her words, she had found a way to transcend the brutality around her. Anne's final days were also marked by an acute sense of time, both fleeting and eternal. Each morning was a struggle against weakness, each evening a test of endurance. Yet she measured time not only by suffering, but also by the inner life she cultivated. She revisited the books she had memorized, the poetry she had admired, and the moral lessons she had drawn from her experiences. In these mental exercises, she experienced the freedom of thought that the camp could not strip away. Even when physical freedom was denied, intellectual and emotional freedom remained a sanctuary. Connection with others continued to play a vital role in Anne's resilience. Though the camp conditions severely limited interaction, she drew strength from brief conversations, shared whispers, or even the presence of someone sitting silently nearby. In these human encounters, no matter how transient, Anne found affirmation that she was not entirely invisible. The acknowledgement of existence, even in its smallest form, became a vital thread in the fabric of her survival. Each encounter, each shared glance, carried with it the subtle promise that life and humanity were not completely extinguished. Even as her body weakened, Anne's reflections on morality, justice, and human nature deepened. She considered why people committed acts of cruelty, why fear and hate spread so rapidly, and why courage and kindness sometimes emerged unexpectedly. These contemplations were not abstract, they were urgent and immediate, guiding her understanding of a world that had betrayed the values she cherished. Anne's mind remained sharp, and in her reflections, she preserved the essence of her humanity, offering a powerful counterpoint to the dehumanization surrounding her. The diary itself became a symbol of enduring hope and memory. As Anne wrote and revised her thoughts, she created a record that would outlive the fleeting physical world around her. She understood, perhaps instinctively, that her words might one day reach others, telling a story of resilience, suffering, and moral insight. In these final writings, she was both a participant in history and an observer, capturing the textures of daily life, the quiet heroism of her peers, and the stark realities of survival. The diary was a testament not only to what had been endured, but to what could be remembered and learned. Ultimately, Anne Frank did not survive Bergen-Belsen. She succumbed to the harsh conditions and the illness that claimed so many of her fellow prisoners. Yet death did not erase her presence. It merely marked the transition from living witness to enduring voice. The words she had carefully inscribed became her legacy, a bridge connecting the horrors of her time to the hearts and minds of generations to come. Through her writings, Anne continues to speak, offering insight, empathy, and a profound reminder of the human capacity for both suffering and hope. The story of Anne Frank's final days is both tragic and illuminating. It is tragic in the absolute sense of loss, of life, of potential, and of the future that was never realized. It is illuminating in the way it reveals the persistence of the human spirit under the most extreme circumstances, even in the moments when her physical existence was imperiled. Anne's mind, heart, and imagination remained free. She demonstrated that resilience is not merely about survival, but about preserving identity, dignity, and hope in a world that seeks to strip them away. Outro. Anne Frank's story is a testament to the endurance of human courage and spirit. Her final days, though marked by suffering, reflect the remarkable ways in which the human mind can cultivate hope, beauty, and understanding, even in the darkest of circumstances. Through her diary, she bequeathed a voice that transcends time, reminding the world that even amid unimaginable tragedy, the human spirit possesses an extraordinary capacity for insight, empathy, and perseverance. Her life, brief yet luminous, continues to inspire millions to recognize the value of compassion, the strength in observing and reflecting upon the world, and the enduring power of one voice to illuminate countless hearts.